have inundated, especially young men.
Yeah.
Go seek freedom. Go do what you want, how you want to do it, when you want to do it, which is fine. There's nothing inherently wrong to that when you're young. But if you really want meaning, if you want satisfaction, if you want direction, it's the stuff that has consequence. It's family, it's work. That's exactly right.
Freedom is.
But we're not teaching young men that.
No.
Intentionally. That's the other thing I wanted to get to, but go ahead.
Right.
I think it's intentional.
Well, I think it is too, because it's part and parcel of the idea that the productive activity of young men, and this also goes for the masculine, symbolically masculine activity of young women, by the way, but the productive activity of young men is indistinguishable from the force that gives rise to the crushing tyranny of the patriarchy. It's like, well, and that also gives young men a moral excuse not to engage in life. It's like, well, productive activity is for fools. I see it all the time. I've
been told I'm a horrible person my whole life. What use is this to me? I'm going to go play video games in my basement.
Yeah, well, it gives an excuse to the useless part of men that don't want to succeed, because it's easy to sit around. I mean, it isn't, because the long-term consequences of that are just absolutely devastating.
Yes.
But see, so when we have a discussion about freedom, we might also say, well, the freedom is, I think this is right, it's freedom to pick your poison, it's freedom to pick your responsibility.
That's correct.
And you might say, well, there's a set of weights in front of you that you have to pick up in order to stand yourself. Because that's the other thing I think about human beings. Well, conscientiousness is a trait. And we don't have an animal model for conscientiousness. In fact, we don't understand conscientiousness at all from a psychological perspective.
Or Darwinian perspective.
Well, that's more complicated, because conscientious men tend to do better, and so they're going to be more successful. But we don't have a model for what conscientiousness is. But conscientiousness is, at least in part, the necessity to carry a load for yourself and for other people, or to suffer guilt and shame as a consequence. And so that seems built in, especially to conscientious people. Now, conscientious people tend to be more conservative, because that's one of the predictors of conservatism. But it could easily be that freedom is the freedom to choose your yoke, let's say. And then you choose the weight that you have to carry, so that you can justify your miserable existence to yourself, so that you can go to bed at the end of the night and you can think, look, I did what I needed to do to set things right today, and I don't have to carry the existential weight around of my failure and uselessness as a consequence. The existential psychologists in the 1950s who emerged out of the chaos of World War II were very much concentrated on the idea of existential guilt, that you owed being a ransom for your existence, and the way that you paid that ransom was to work for the betterment of being. I mean, it's a very ancient idea, but it is the one idea, I think, that gives people the self-respect, not self-esteem, the self-respect that's necessary to carry them through terrible times.
When I'm asked, well, what has Jordan Peterson done for your members, the people you know, I say, he has them to stop acting like Peter Pan. So that they can actually be a man and not a boy.
Well, the Peter Pan story is a really interesting one, because Peter Pan means everything. Yeah, and it's a very powerful story, which is why people still tell it.
What's one piece of advice that you would have given your 16-year-old self?
Don't be so high and mighty that you don't take advantage of the humble opportunities that are granted to you. When I look back, I didn't like school at all. You might say I hated it. And I thought a lot about that, because I thought, well, there were reasons. I was a very fast reader. I could get through the books that were given to us in English class generally in the first day. And that wasn't really appreciated, I would say. But there were things, and I was bored a lot as a teenager, and got into a reasonable amount of trouble, not an unreasonable amount, but then, there were sports teams, and there were attempts to organize plays, and there were things that I didn't do that I could have, that would have made my life better. But I was too cynical, maybe, to take full advantage of them. And I did work when I was a kid. I worked in restaurants as a dishwasher, short order cook, that sort of thing. That was a really good decision. I think my fondest memories in some ways of my adolescence are memories of working in the restaurant. But don't, like, life is very difficult, and in order to thrive with this difficult life, if an opportunity is presented to you, you shouldn't be so arrogant that you dismiss it. And it's really easy to be arrogant as a teenager, especially if you're smart, because you think, well, I'm smarter than everybody else. It's like, actually, no. There's lots of people that are a lot smarter than you. You just haven't met them yet. And you're not as smart as you think you are, besides, and other people aren't as dumb as you think they are either.
There's different kinds of smart.
There certainly is. Yes, and wise beats smart. So I would say if you're 16 and your life isn't so happy, it's like, look around and see if there are opportunities that people are granting you, even imperfect opportunities, because they're going to be imperfect, that you could exploit, let's say, in the proper way, and learn and grow. I had this teacher, Ada Paul. She's dead now. I really liked her in grade 4. She was an organist at the church. And when I was 14, 15, she offered to teach me how to play the organ. I, for a variety of reasons, wasn't really that into the idea. And so I kind of went, and then a couple of times I skipped it, and it just sort of fell apart, and which was pretty rude of me, obviously, because she went out of her way to offer this. And like, that's a good example, because like, it wasn't cool to play the organ. It wasn't cool to do I don't know what it was like when you grew up. When I grew up, it wasn't cool to do anything. She was a great teacher. Like, I really liked Ada Paul. She was, and I betrayed her trust, It's like, that wasn't very bright.
I think we all have memories like that as kids,
Yeah.
But I think that advice is good to even young adults, even to adults, really, to pause and appreciate the opportunities and the doors that are always open to them.
Well,
the experiences that are always available.
Well, here's an idea.
Yeah.
So life is brutal, and what you have to set against that is possibility. And you might say, well, life is so brutal that you have to utilize all the possibility that comes your way. So an opportunity manifests itself and you turn it down. You ignore it, you let it drift away. It's like, that's one thing that you had against the horror of existence that you let go of. You let go of 10 of those things, man. You're on the street.
Right.
And it's no fun there. And it doesn't get better. And so there is a possibility that if you utilized all the possibility that was offered to you, that your life would be straight and clean and engaging and acceptable and positive. And that's worth finding out if that's the case, because it might be true. Find out that edge that you can push yourself against. And it's going to be different for different people. But that's the call to adventure and heroism. And there are life and death situations everywhere around you if you want to involve yourself in them. Now, and sometimes that might be like to put yourself together to the degree that you can, say physically or spiritually or intellectually. It could be an intellectual battle. It could be a moral battle. Like, the frontier is everywhere. The frontier is just the edge between what you know and what you don't know. You want to put yourself on that damn edge and make yourself into something. And you can retreat into comfort in the modern world. And I think that is a problem. I've noticed that it's one of the pathologies of wealth, I would say, because one of the problems with being relatively wealthy if you're a parent is that you cannot provide your children with necessity. And that's a big problem, because they need necessity to call them into being. And, if you don't have a lot of material resources and your children ask you for something, you can say no, because no is the answer. It's like, no, we can't do that. But if you can say yes, then it's really hard to say no, because then you're just arbitrary. Well, I don't know. It's like Kierkegaard said, there'll come a time when we have so much security and comfort that what we'll want more than anything else is deprivation and challenge. And I think that's particularly what young men want. we tend to think of meaning as something that people create as a secondary consequence through thinking or through philosophy or something like that. And when we think that, it's easy to criticize it. It's easy to become cynical about it. It's easy to lose faith in it. But when you understand that it actually is a much deeper phenomenon than that, and that the cognitive elements, the philosophical elements, are sort of like, well, they're like the fronds on the top of the pond on a plant system that has unbelievably deep roots that go way down into the water. There's something about that that's much firmer and more solid. And I think the evidence that meaning is an instinct, a deep, deep instinct, is overwhelming. I don't think that popular knowledge has caught up with that. I mean, the research it's not new, but it's been done, I would say, in the main in the last 30 years or so, and mostly by psychobiologists, like people who are really on the hard science end of psychology. And their work is difficult. It's technically difficult. It involves a lot of neurobiology, neuroanatomy, psychopharmacology. It's hard work. It's hard going, but it's unbelievably useful. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient, because meaning is an instinct. And meaning is the instinct that guides you in life across the totality of life, right? What's expedient, that's what you might want to do right now in an impulsive sense, right? Because you're driven forward by, anger or anxiety or frustration or disappointment or despair, some sort of one-eyed motivational monster that's got you in its grip that really isn't considering everything at once, right? Like considering your life tomorrow or your life next week or your family's life or maybe even your well-being half an hour from now, because you lash out in anger, and people do that. It's understandable. Sometimes it's even necessary, but it's not wise generally. And the instinct for meaning seems to be a consequence of the integration of all of those underlying motivations and emotions with social being, and then the manifestation of something like the proper pathway forward. And you need that because you need to know how to move forward in life, because you need to move forward in life. You need to act in life. And the other thing that's, I suppose, part and parcel of, let's say, 12 rules for life is the insistence upon action as of primary import. We're not fundamentally creatures who passively perceive the objective world. That's not the goal of our perceptual systems. It's not the goal of our memory. The reason that you have memories isn't to remember the past. The reason you have memories is so that if something bad happened to you in the past, you can figure out what it was that was bad, and you can figure out why it happened, and then you can not do it again in the future, right? It's very practical. And it's the same on the positive end of the spectrum. If good things happen to you in the past, then conceivably duplicating whatever you did to get those good things to happen could have them happen again in the future. So it's practical memory, and it's oriented towards action, and it's oriented towards like the quality of your life. So you need that instinct for meaning too. So, and we should get this real straight. Why do you need it? Well, you need it because life is really, really difficult, right? I mean, people have a rough time of it. There's plenty of suffering in life, and everyone is going to encounter it, right? You learn this as a clinical psychologist, and you know this generally, unless you're an extraordinarily fortunate person. You don't have to talk to someone for very long and really talk to them and get beneath the surface until you find, there's a tragedy or two or three or 10 lurking not very far beneath the surface. Someone in the family is very ill. There's a childhood history of extreme pathology, alcoholism somewhere in the family, maybe a touch of insanity. Someone has cancer. Some older relative is dying. There's financial trouble. There's economic trouble. There's marital trouble. It's like life is trouble. And now, that doesn't mean it's all trouble, but man, it's trouble. And sometimes it's a lot of trouble. And sometimes it's so much trouble that you can barely stand it. And you see that because people get depressed and they commit suicide. And the reason they do that is because they think not being is better than being. And that's quite the decision, So, and it's not that uncommon among people who are depressed. And so it's a very important thing to consider. And it isn't just a matter of depression and suicide. That's bad enough. But if you're unhappy because your suffering has pushed you past the point of your ability to cope, then there's all sorts of other things that can happen to you that aren't directed towards you. You can become cynical, and you can become bitter, and you can become cruel, and you can become narcissistic and deceitful and arrogant, and it's like everything's for you. And then you're out for revenge. That's a nice one. I don't know against who, but maybe everyone. Maybe even including you, because you're not happy about the role you've played in generating your own misery. I mean, there's a lot of darkness underneath the suffering. And so, and that's an ever-present existential danger for human beings. We're aware of the future. We're aware of our fragility. We're aware of our mortality. It's something that makes us truly unique, truly conscious in a way that no other creature is, and capable of things that no other creature can do, but also bearing an unbelievably heavy existential load. We're the only creatures that have to always contend with the fact that we're finite and that everyone we know is in the same position, that allied with the suffering. And so that's there all the time. And even in the brightest moments, in some sense, in Renaissance paintings, in still lifes, they used to put a memento mori often in the still life, like a skull somewhere in the corner, or sometimes in a very strange perspective, so that you could only see the skull if you were standing like right beside the painting instead of dead on. But the idea was to always remember, that everything that exists is tainted or touched with the taint of mortality. And that's rough, but there's some useful things in it. It keeps you awake, and it keeps you focused if you're careful. But it also does indicate to you, if you think about it, the necessity of having a meaning in your life. It's bad enough to have something bad happen to you, and it's likely that that'll happen. But it's even worse for you to do it to yourself and to know that you did it. That's rough. And it's also extraordinarily rough to be betrayed by someone else, or tyrannized by your own culture. And that's not just suffering. That's like unnecessary and pointless suffering that's being directed at you by something that wants that to happen. And so both of those are very, very powerful, let's say, archetypal forces, suffering and malevolence, and we have to deal with them at every level of reality. And you need something to push back against that. It's not optional. I've read the accounts and the actions of people who've taken a very vicious turn into the darkest parts of the underworld, consequence of their resentment and their malevolence, and then their desire to make everything in the world suffer for the outrage of its existence, man. I mean, that's how we turn things into hell. If you want to know why totalitarian states take the brutal twists they take, and why people are motivated to do the absolutely terrible things that they do, well, that's why, is that the suffering and the malevolence that's intrinsic to life overwhelms them, and they turn in a very bad direction, and then they make everything that's already bad way worse, and we're very, very inventive at such things. And so that's not good, unless that's the path you want. That's a bad idea. You need an alternative, and that's meaning. How much trouble would you want there not to be? It's a weird question, right? Because you want to have something to contend with. You want to have something that forces from you the best that you have. And so you have to have real problems. It's something like that. Would you dispense with all your real... You could just lay down on a bed and have pablum infused into your mouth, if all your problems were solved. And so maybe you want difficult problems that you can solve, something like that, because there's some... I don't know what it is about it. There's the overcoming and the growth that comes along with that. There's something about the nobility of the enterprise. You certainly see that when you go about having children, for example, which is, the psychological literature is quite clear. If you do moment-to-moment comparisons of people who have kids and people who don't have kids, the people who don't have kids are happier. And so psychologists who tend to get things wrong even when they make intelligent discoveries like that one, immediately, some of them, jump to the conclusion that because happiness is the goal, that, well, there's something about children that, make you unhappy, and that's not good. It's like, well, wait a second. Maybe that's the wrong metric. It's like, Of course you're less happy once you have children because you have to worry about them. You know, my neighbor down the street, who's a very smart woman, said to me once, you can only be as happy as your unhappiest child. And which I thought was really good, you know, that's really smart. But then it isn't, well, if having children doesn't make you happy, the answer isn't don't have children. It's like, don't be so stupid about being happy. That's the answer. It's because there's a nobility in the pursuit, right? And of course, now you're responsible. You know, you have a new baby, you think, especially if you're a new parent, you think, oh, what the hell is this? And what am I going to do with it? You know, it's like, and then you're done for the rest of your life. You never sleep properly again because you're going to be worried about this creature that you have to take care of. But like, what the hell good are you if you're not doing that, or something else equally difficult? Because you just haven't been called out yet, unless you take on a responsibility like that. And the idea that life is, you know, that happiness is the purpose of life. It's like, great for happiness, man. If it comes along, you should be thrilled that it's visiting you. But the notion that that's what you should pursue, that's the weakest possible notion. First of all, as soon as something terrible happens to you, you're done. It's like, life is to be happy. It's like, well, now you have cancer. So how's that? How's the happiness thing working out for you now? Or maybe it's not you, you know, maybe it's your father that has Alzheimer's disease or some damn thing. And, you know, it's like, it's a rare person that doesn't have some catastrophe one person away from them. It's like, life is to be happy. That's not right. And we can at least derive that from these stories. That isn't what they say at all. God's perfectly happy in the stories to grant the people with whom he forms a covenant happiness and prosperity, but there's never a word that that's the purpose. The rule is aim high and get your bloody act together. That's the rule, and establish this contractual covenant with the ultimate ideal, and that will see you through the catastrophes. And that's a much more mature way of looking at life, as far as I'm concerned, because all you have to do is have your eyes half open, and you see that the fundamental reality of life is tragedy and suffering. That's inescapable. That doesn't mean that it makes life unbearable, or that it makes being something that shouldn't have existed. Right? That isn't what it means. But it means that you have to contend with it, and you have to get ready. And the willingness to adopt responsibility for yourself and for others is the precondition for that. And then maybe if you do that properly, then now and then you get some happiness. You know, you can sit at the end of a day and you have half an hour where your conscience is clear and there's nothing that you need to be doing, and you can relax and think, you know, that's all right. Things are okay, and thank God for that. And that's maybe where you get your happiness. So it's sort of predicated on the idea that life is for happiness. And I don't think that's right. And I don't think that's how people experience life. And I might be wrong. But it seems to me that people experience life as something like a series of crucial ethical decisions. It's something like that. I mean, I just can't imagine, and maybe I'm being naive about this, but I can't imagine another being that's like me in most senses, that isn't constantly wrestling in some sense with what the next proper thing to do is. It's not like it's obvious. It's not bloody obvious. And it doesn't mean you'll do the right thing, because you don't lots of times. And you know that by your own judgment, right? Because you're making mistakes all the time. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing, and maybe it's a mistake and maybe it isn't. And who's to say? That isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you know that what you're doing is wrong and you go ahead and do it anyways. People do that all the time. And that's also extremely peculiar. You bloody well think that if you knew it was wrong and you told yourself that it was wrong, that would be sufficient, so that you just wouldn't do it. But that isn't what you're like at all, you know. And you can tell yourself something is wrong 50 times and you'll do it the 51st time, and then you'll feel, you know, like you deserve to feel, probably. But it doesn't stop you. And so then I think the other problem with the viewpoint, the idea that the suffering of life eradicates its utility, is that it's predicated on the idea that happiness, or lack of suffering even, is the right criteria by which to judge life. And I don't think that's how we actually experience life. I think what we do instead is put ourselves through a series of excruciating moral choices. You know, and one of the things that's really significant about the biblical stories, and I think about the entire implicit philosophy, that's embedded in the stories, is that that's how life is presented in the stories, is all of these individuals. First, they're individuals, they're not groups. And second, they're agonizing over their moral choices all the time. And they have a relationship with God. But it's not a directive relationship, exactly. Even the people to whom God speaks directly, which I suspect is not something you'd exactly want to have happen, they're still, even the fact that they have a direct relationship with God doesn't stop them from being tormented continually by their moral choices. And so the world is presented as a moral landscape, not as a place that justifies itself by happiness. It's presented as a moral landscape, and people are presented as creatures who traverse through the moral landscape, making ethical decisions that determine the course of the world. And that seems to me to be right. And that's not the same as happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's a whole different category of being. And and then I've thought that through a lot, and I think, well, we do make choices, and what we do is contend with the future, and the future seems to appear to us as a realm of possibility. That's a more accurate way of thinking about it than that the future presents itself to us as a realm of determined things. It presents itself as a realm of possibility, and there's good choices in that realm, and there's poor choices or even evil choices in that realm. And we're negotiating continually, deciding which of those choices we're going to bring into being. That seems to me to be phenomenologically indisputable, and we certainly treat each other as if that's what we're doing, because we hold each other responsible for our actions, with some exceptions, and that we're deciding each moment whether to make things better or worse. There's a profound anti-human ethos, I think, that pervades our culture, that considers human beings cancers on the planet, something like that, and that there should be less of us. It's the same spirit that motivated the guy who wrote the book about it better to have never been. And it's like, I don't see it that way, I think people do pretty well for having their leg caught in a bear trap and their head caught in a vice. They're actually doing pretty well, because life is really hard, and the fact that we're not absolutely brutal and murderous all the time is really something remarkable, given what we actually have to contend with, that we can go out of our way to be honest and generous and altruistic and to care for each other under unbelievably dire circumstances, and to act nobly sometimes under the most trying conditions. In Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, he tells story after story of people who acted abysmally, but also people who, under the worst threats imaginable, never sacrificed their character. And reading about that is really, well, it really makes you wonder. That's what it does.